I was born into a Roman Catholic family. Myself, my two sisters, my mother and my father were strong Catholics, but not fanatical. Ours, the way we were raised and the way our religion worked for us, was as a gentle religion, but one nonetheless had its own requirements and standards. I do recall when I was going to Sunday school, my first ever question came into my mind, and that was with respect to the to Genesis 2, where I always wondered about the concept of original sin. It didn't seem fair somehow to my young ears that everybody should be condemned to all this life of misery as was described in Genesis, just for the actions of one individual or to a pair of individuals. It just didn't seem quite fair somehow. That was the only doubt that I was actually expressing during those years. For the most part, I remained a very loyal little Catholic boy, went to parochial school, got my lessons in the catechism, became an altar boy, and remember being confirmed at the age of 7. Went on from there, but in my later teen years, I began to have some real problems with my Catholicism. I found that after a while I could no longer relate to the Mass. Somehow it just became empty ritual for me. And I was having increasing difficulty just dealing with that. I can remember praying as hard as I possibly could for some help to get me back on track somehow. But those prayers, I felt, were never answered. So the doubts continued to plague me. When I was age 19, and some of you have already heard this story, I had my one and only epiphany when at the banks of St. Lawrence looking out over the river, I remember looking up at the sky. Now normally for some people this is a very spiritual experience, but for me it was of a different sort. For I had been a physics major and saw the stars in perhaps a rather different way than most people do. But I remember looking up that one night and completely unbidden, I suddenly realized for myself that I no longer believed in an afterlife. And for me, it was a tremendously liberating experience. All the guilt I had been racking myself through suddenly seemed to go away. Interestingly enough, that did not affect my idea about God. Not that I had much of an idea about God in those days, but nonetheless, I knew that the question of God, whatever God is, or even if God exists, was a totally separate issue to whether or not I believed in an afterlife. But my doubts continued, my questions continued, my angst continued with the church, and then I finally decided I just had enough, I had to leave, which I did. I just stopped attending church. Not for any real doctrinal issues or problems with pastors or ministers or priests or anything like that, just because it was no longer relevant to me. And I decided to put all these religious questions to one side because I was no longer able to really deal with them at that point in my life. I decided at some point later in my life I would have to come back to these, but not now. I just decided this was the time to get on with the rest of my life. And so it was. 1 month ago, we had a little over a month ago, we had a 3-person panel up here. Some of you who were at that service will recall that. We had an agnostic, an atheist, and a theist, each presenting their own views, and then some feedback after the service. It was an interesting service, but I felt at the time, and still do, that there are many more variants to those 3 than we normally probably tend to believe. Like most elements of human life, belief in whatever, or lack thereof, is a much more complex affair. So I devoted this service, I decided, to a further exploration of some of those major options, along with a few others. Atheism. Hard atheism. God, gods, or other supernatural powers do not exist. Very definite affirmative statement. Or soft atheism. I do not believe in gods or other supernatural beings. One is an expression of outward reality, the other is an expression of personal belief. Because I could be wrong. Then there's a third category, which is not often mentioned in the literature, which I think is important to include, which I call practical atheism. This is practiced by people who behave as if God did not exist. Whatever their professed belief, whether or not they attend a church, synagogue, temple, or whatever, the way they lead their ordinary lives day to day is as if there were no God. No reference is made to God during the week. No thoughts about God. No thought about is this the right thing to do? Is this what God expects of me? None of that occurs. You behave as if God did not exist. 3 flavors of atheism. I experienced, at least I tried it on for size, particularly while I was in Red Deer, president of the Red Deer Fellowship, just to see how this would fit me. It turned out not to be a very comfortable fit. It was, to my personal way of thinking, a little too doctrinaire for me. I was not comfortable wearing that particular cloak. After that, I became really decidedly and quite definitely an agnostic, which I was for about 40 years. Now, agnosticism also has its flavors. There's hard agnosticism. And the best way to describe that by means of a bumper sticker that I acquired some years ago at a General Assembly, I believe it was in St. Louis. I never quite had the guts to put it on my bumper, but here it is. It says, "Militant agnostic. I don't know and you don't either." That's hard agnosticism. Hard agnosticism claims that there can be no proof that God does or does not exist. It just simply is not possible ever to know. Then there is weak agnosticism. There is no proof now, one way or the other, concerning God's existence, though one day there may be a way to decide the question. Soft agnosticism. That's weak agnosticism. Soft agnosticism, and this is where I would have put myself during those years. I do not know whether or not God exists. Either is possible, but one day I may be able to find this out. That's soft agnosticism. And it's pretty much where I stood during most of my years as a Unitarian, as a soft agnostic. Meaning that I could understand the world both with a God and without a God. And so finely balanced was that I could have no grounds for deciding, to my way of thinking at the time, whether or not I should swing one way or the other. But I always had somewhere in my background my hope that someday I might be able to decide for myself and jump off that fence. There's one aspect of atheism that has always struck me. Atheism is a very courageous position to take, because it means you cannot depend on any external force, any outside power, any heavenly support in what you do with your life. And what you do with your life is entirely up to you. There's no divine purpose that you must discover. There is only purpose that you can create for yourself. But what that does mean, however, that there is also a risk. You can devote your life to certain causes and never see them bear fruit. You may devote your life to causes which are not so pleasant, and those may or may not bear fruit. So there's no guarantees of what's going to happen, how you devote yourself in life is going to work out the way you planned, but you can celebrate the such successes that you have achieved. It is your success, not some divine intervention that has succeeded. For myself, as I said, I tried on that particular cloak, found it didn't suit me, really. I tried on for many years the notion of agnosticism, right middle of the road agnosticism, soft agnosticism. But then I think I finally reached a point in my life where I felt I had to look at this whole question. Where do I really stand on this? I was getting older now. It was time to come back to those questions which I had put aside in my youth. I began at a men's retreat led by Reverend Brian Kiley down in Washington State one year, where I decided I would use that opportunity to explore that question for myself. And I tried to work it out. As I said, I have a science background, both in physics and in philosophy of science. So I said to myself, well, okay, let's take a look at this whole question of God. God has often been described as the creator of the universe. But when I look at the universe itself, I do not see signs of God there. I see signs of an impersonal, developmental, evolutionary process that's traceable back to the 10 to the minus 47th of a second of existence of the universe during the Big Bang. I said to myself, well, okay, what caused the Big Bang? Natural enough question. Is this where I would describe God? Not Isaac Newton, when he formulated his laws of motion, could not understand gravity, how gravity worked. He could describe the laws of gravity very well. But he finally decided that gravity was a mysterious force that demonstrated the action of God. That was his idea. That's how he placed God. But the more we learn about the world, the more we learn about evolution, the harder it is to sustain that belief. And the further back you go in time, you say, okay, well, maybe this is the point at which God came into being. Maybe at the creation of life, but that doesn't seem to work out too well either, what biologists keep telling us. So it kept getting further and further back, all the way back to my way of thinking, to the Big Bang. What I came to at that point was the idea that if there is a God, it must be a deistic God. So, what is deism? Deism is basically came about in mostly 18th century. It's quite popular, particularly among the founders of the American Republic. And what it describes is the idea that there is a single God, but God created the universe and the laws that govern it, but does not interfere in its operation in general or with humanity in particular. Well, that seemed to fit with my belief system at that point. Deism. Yeah, a God got it all started like a winding up a big clock, and has let the clock go, and has not had anything to do with it ever since. Maybe he was winding up some other clock somewhere else. Deism. By the same time that I reached that conclusion, I also made another discovery, probably about myself, and that is that I'm not going to get to God through here. Through here alone, that got me as far as deism. But if I'm to find God in any other way, or any other kind of God, whatever it is, I'm going to find it in here. Not through my mind, but through my heart. So I waited for a long time to see where that would lead me, because I didn't know how to do that. Finally, a few years ago, I had an experience. There was something I had been working on in myself with some success, but I decided that to maintain my efforts in this regard, I needed something more. So for the first time in over 40 years, I prayed. It was not a very orderly prayer. It was a very creaky kind of prayer. Very rough around the edges, but I prayed anyway. Just for some assistance, not so much for some help, but some sense that there was some support out there. And for the first time in my experience, I felt answered. Oh, there was no burning bush, no voice coming out of the clouds, nothing like that. It was just a sense of comfort came over me at that moment. That was my heart experience of God. And that finally pushed me over into theism. Now, theism itself, of course, has many flavors. I'll get back to my story in a minute, but let's talk about theism in general. There's traditional theism, the one that we all know about. God created the universe, cares about it, and exerts moral leadership and judgment upon humanity. That's the traditional theism that most of us probably are acquainted with, and many of us grew up believing in. There are other ideas about theistic God, and you heard Fran describe one of these in her sermon of a month ago, when she described panentheism. How many of you were here for that service? Okay, I'll give you a quick description of it. Panentheism is a belief that the universe is a manifestation of God, but that God is more than just the material universe. Sort of pantheism plus. It's the belief or doctrine that there is more to God than the universe, which includes and interpenetrates it. And just as the universe continues to evolve, so does the entity we call God. Now, panentheists generally do not ascribe to God the kinds of characteristics we were brought up to believe are characteristic of God. God is not omnipotent to the panentheist. God is not eternal. God is not all-powerful. And in particular, God is not all-knowing. So you have all those denials. God instead evolves, just as the universe itself evolves over time. So when you say revelation is not closed, we mean there's still more to learn, both about God, our relationship to God, and the world, the universe as a whole. There's always going to be more to learn. And one of our minister that I know, now retired, has said that his vision of an afterlife for him is that it's a place where you will continue to learn, continue to develop, continue to evolve, continue to change. There's still more to be learned even after this life ends. That was his vision of God. There are also other views of God besides those. Well, there's the ancient one of animism, but not so ancient, it's still practiced in some parts of the world. The belief that all natural things, such as plants, animals, rocks, thunder, volcanoes, have spirits that can influence human events, and therefore often must be sacrificed to, so as to placate them or to bring them on side. Then there is the belief in multiple gods or goddesses, each of whom possesses specific powers and can interfere in human affairs and with each other. And this might include modern Wiccans, for example. So there's that kind of belief as well. So theism has many flavors. So what flavor has it had for me personally? Well, it's a hard one to answer, because I do not know what this God of mine is. I do not know what powers or characteristics it has. Other than that, it can provide me with comfort, which suggests that it is aware of me and it cares. And that's virtually all I know about God. There is an ancient Christian practice that was performed by people who were preparing to become Christians. These were the ones, I'm not talking about the ones who became Christian by the sword, become a Christian or die type of thing, which was also pretty common back in those days. I'm talking about a serious catechumen, an adult preparing to become a Christian. They went through a process which basically takes, take all these simple catechism descriptions of God. Take each one of them in turn. Some of you have heard me say this on other occasions. Take each of those in turn, like God is justice. Fine. Now we know what justice means in human terms, at least we think we do. We freely admit there are many different justice systems, but at least we have an understanding generally of what it means. When we say this to God, God is so much more than human. What does it really mean? And interestingly enough, Ecclesiastes addressed that question quite directly. If any of you remember my Ecclesiastes service from some time back, which said that your ideas about justice, you think that just because somebody has been evil, they're going to get punished right away, or because somebody has lived a good life, that therefore they're going to be rewarded in this life. Ha! It's all folly. Ridiculous. Yes, there is God's justice, but you don't understand what God's justice is. No human being does. Justice will be exerted in whatever way God decides to exert it, whether it be now, later in life, or 3 generations down the road. Justice will be served. God's justice will be served. But don't pretend that you understand what it is. So, back to the catechumens. Each of those characteristics of God, they were invited to explore and ask themselves the question, what does it mean when you apply that term to God? In every case, you come out with the feeling that, I don't know. I don't know what that really means. And you come out of this at the end of the day with a sense of awe, of the feeling that you realize that God is so far beyond human comprehension that no human being can understand the nature of God. We can only understand such things as God whenever God interacts with us. We can understand a little piece of it, maybe. That's all we'll ever grasp. One of the interesting things that some atheists will say with respect to this question of God is, give me a definition of God, and I'll tell you whether or not I believe in it. Fully expecting that no definition you supply is ever going to satisfy. What's interesting is that if this notion of God is the correct one, or anything approaching it, you will not be able to give a definite answer to that kind of a question. But you will not feel uncomfortable with that. You may not satisfy the atheists who ask that of you, but you can try to explain where you're coming from on this, and then see what he says, or she. So that's a theistic position. But before we leave theism, and there are many other flavors too, I suppose one could add, there are also, and I should at least mention these, some intermediate positions. I've just described one of them. Without a clear definition of who or what God is, the question is meaningless or unanswerable. But there's another one too, which you may not have been too aware of. It even has a name. Apathyism. Apathyism. I don't know and I don't care. That's apathyism. And it's closely related to practical atheism. I don't know and I don't care. I'm not interested in the question. I'm not going to deal with it. So it's neither an affirmation or denial. It simply says, I'm leaving it aside forever. I don't care. So, and then you also, of course, have some non-theistic religions, such as non-theistic Buddhism, which has no creator God and gives a central role to the doctrine of karma and the doctrine of personal evolution and development to achieve a higher state of being. So those are some of the characteristics of theistic belief and its related areas. And now I invite you into a time of reflection, both over what you may have heard today, anything new that you may have learned, any way in which this might have affected you personally, and what is it that you yourself believe, and how does it affect your life? That perhaps is the most important question of all. When we complete the reflection, I've invited Marcia to lead us in a feedback period, share some of your ideas and some of your thoughts, some of your feelings perhaps, on the question of God.
John, you suggested that one of the downsides of being an atheist or agnostic is that there are no guarantees. So my question for you is, what guarantees do you have now as a theist?
The only guarantee that I have as a theist now is that there's something more than just myself or ourselves in the universe. There's something out there that really does care, that is aware and cares, and will have to provide some support. I do not know, and I certainly can't speak with any authority on this one at all, whether or not this God that I profess to believe in intervenes in any way in the natural state of things. I rather doubt it, or at least if it does so in a manner that does not violate any physical laws. In other words, it's something extremely subtle.
So it's just that something cares.
Something out there really cares, yes, and it's benevolent.
Anyone else? Now's your time.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I have to say, these are two panelists from May 15th. So I'm glad you two came in. You did.
John, it strikes me just in your answer to Jim's question that you're trying to have it both ways. You become a theist because it gives you hope. I guess it enhances a sense of purpose. but at the same time, God doesn't interfere with the natural order of things. So it's a God that doesn't play, whose role doesn't give rise to practical implications, but it's a God that somehow makes you, I don't want to state your views, but it makes you feel like your life is deeper and has purpose or meaning. And it strikes me as we're conflating the notion of belief and hope. We hope that there's more than just what we experience in our lives. We hope there's something else. But at the same time, you can see it's not a God that whose actions or judgments somehow affect your life. I just have a tough time reconciling that. And that's why I see it as being more a function of hope than belief.
I would not agree that I believe in God in order to find hope. If there's hope there, it's because, as a result, not because of, I would put it in the reverse. There's enough of the agnostic, enough of the humanists left in me still to feel that this God expects me and all of us to do our bit. We cannot sit back and depend on God's intervention in the general scheme of things in order to make life work out the way I personally want it to be. I do not particularly relate well to prayers which asks for things like my favorite sports team, for example. When they all huddle before the game, a quick little prayer to God to help them out when both teams are doing the same thing at the same time. So I do not look for hope that way. I still expect that God will expect us to do our bit. There's no guarantees for any one particular cause that things will work out the way I want it to. I said we do not understand the justice of God. God's justice is whatever it is. It's not something I can comprehend. And oftentimes we see things work out very badly for groups of people, for individuals. We can't understand how God could let that happen. Common enough. How could God allow my son to have been killed in Rome, for example? How could that have happened? So there are many cases like that that come up. And I don't have an answer to that as a theist. But God is available. In what ways that God will help you, maybe just to give you a little bit of strength, perhaps. I don't pray to God, I don't believe in God in order to get the strength. I get the strength because I believe in God. I would put it the other way around. That's the best answer I can give to that question.
Thank you. Another John.
Yes. Thank you, John, for this very interesting survey overview on the different kinds of flavors, as you put it, of beliefs, etc. In fact, I want to point out we did have a series in the Free Thinker Forum where we did investigate a lot of the things very similar, and we came out in many ways the same way. But I want to mention two things. One, I really appreciate the fact that you point out there are different definitions, for example, of atheism. And, for example, you talk about hard atheism, somebody who knows there is no God. And one of the, I think, major sources of conflict between people is they have the wrong definition, or they, put it this way, they ascribe to somebody on the other camp a definition which is not really very realistic. And for example, I'll talk about atheism. I think I appreciate Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists of the world, who has he has the 7 steps of atheism, with number 7 being somebody who knows there is no God, back to somebody who just doesn't believe in God. So he himself doesn't even put himself in that category. And I think in many cases, theists, in my opinion, ascribe to atheists this hard force and say, how could they possibly know? And therefore all atheists are wrong. My point being, Most atheists, in my opinion, do not have that hard position. It's something much different. So that's my first point, which is that we have to be aware of how we put the wrong definition on people who are on the other side of the fence. And it's a straw man, actually, or a straw person. Second point I want to make, which I think is also useful, is that you point out different flavors. And I think critical to the idea of do you believe in God is how do you define God? And that's the vital question, really. Because if you say God is some entity, some person, something out there who cares about people, intervenes in the world, the creator of the universe cares whether or not your daughter's soccer team wins. I mean, if that's what God believes, if that's what your definition of God must include, then, most people say, that's ridiculous. I shouldn't say most people. I would say it's ridiculous. That the creator of the trillions of stars out there would be paying attention to exactly what you're doing in your bedroom at night. On the other hand, you did seem to dismiss the other end definition where it's deism. The original God wound up the clock and let the universe happen after that. To me, that's much harder to find any reason not to believe. And I can easily tell how you could say, well, I'm defining the winding of the clock as some mysterious evolutionary digital whatever force, and but it does not at all describe very accurately the people who are blowing themselves up at the Turkish airport. And that's the problem with it, that it's a belief in God that doesn't cause the problems. It's the other kind, the believers who, I'm rambling here, sorry, I'll terminate in 30 seconds. It's the beliefs in God that seem to have unique, chosen people, and they're unique. That's, to me, is the reason why, as an atheist, I'm so worried about those believers, because it's not, they won't let well enough alone. They will blow up the people who don't agree with them. And so that's the definition of God that I really worry about.
Sorry. Okay, sure.
That last bit of thinking, I think, invites the question of the relationship between organized religions and the belief or disbelief in God. And while they're comparable in some ways, I think organized religions to a degree exploit that discussion, institutionalizing. And I think it was Dawkins himself who said, you referred to the Turkish airport we had Baghdad last night, where, if you can believe the news, you have one sect of Muslims who hate another sect so much that they would target and kill 100 kids last night. Just unbelievable that, but you see, I don't think it's the beliefs so much as the mobilizing of people into collective groups that carry out certain agendas, which, as Dawkins said, good people generally do good things, evil people often do evil things, but it takes religion to make good people do evil things. And that was the way he tried to describe the impact of religions by exploiting this discussion of God and then mobilizing people for evil purposes. So I think we have to keep the two areas distinct.
Thank you. I guess mulling over everything I've heard this morning, especially this last, I think the long history of religions have given us examples on both sides. Mustering people to do great good in the world, self-sacrifice and contributions, and the opposite, as we see in the times we happen to be living. But I think one thing, I can go back to John's talk, that I really appreciated and was mulling over in my mind for the first time this morning is the idea of a behavioral apatheism. And I find myself so many times, what is it about my life that has led me back to a movement like this, where I want to be involved in these discussions week in and week out, either with you or with the children in the children's program. And yet I know that I'm, one of a very small number, because most people are out. What are they doing? They're having brunch. They're hiking up the Grouse Grind. They're, taking their kids to soccer, because that's when girls can play. They are behaving in such a way as if this God question does not exist. So even though I have, like you, I parked this issue out in the field of agnosticism long ago, and I haven't really reined it in from there. That's where I'm comfortable. I still think, what is it that keeps me wanting to mull over these questions? Well, so many others around me, the younger generation especially, are the nuns. What is your religious affiliation? None. And this is where we find ourselves in North America right now. So anyway, a few thoughts. Anyone else? Yes, gosh.
I wanted to speak for the side of theism in all its wonderful manifestations, and those that are visible, those that are invisible. Because one of these statements that John Silverman that interested me was the one that you made last, which is how does your belief in God or non-belief in God impact your life? What is the behavior that follows from either end or the middle of the spectrum? I think that this is something that has probably worked out most effectively in social settings, because I've always found it very easy to be holier than thou when I'm by myself, but I find it really hard to be as spiritual, if that's the word I want, to talk about when I'm in company with people whose company I don't enjoy, or whose behavior I have not had pleasure in. So I would wonder what the different experiences of theism or atheism, agnostic to theism, has meant in terms of the change in your behavior, if any.
Is that a direct question?
That's a direct question too, yeah. I obviously have my own answers for that, but it was really I wanted to speak about, because you've given us an overview of your journey.
I don't know if I had an easy answer to that any more than probably most people here, but for me at least, it's given me comfort in the sense that I feel like I must be on the right track on something here. What I do here at church, for example, theologians' cafes, the way I try to be of service for something that I always felt strongly about. You don't have to be a theist to feel that. Many atheists, agnostics, and so forth, other flavors of theism, have a strong sense of social responsibility as well, so I can't claim uniqueness in that regard, though I tried it. But it does help me a little bit to say, okay, I'm not altogether on the wrong track, I must be doing something right. So I'll just carry on and try to do more of it, harder perhaps, more intelligently, whatever. The other thing it's given me too, this whole life journey that I've gone through has given me a great deal more tolerance for differences. First of all, it's given me more awareness of differences and more tolerance of differences too. Which is something to become a better Unitarian, I suppose. But certainly those are things which my journey has given me over time. And beyond that, I'm not sure I can give you any more definite replies.